I'm curious first to get your take on this question of what comes next with regard to the shutdown.
Good morning, Julie. I think it probably ends by Thanksgiving for precisely the reasons that you're mentioning. The kind of the practical pain that people will go through, whether it be air traffic, whether it be SNAP benefits, even the economic data or lack of it probably plays a role in all of that. But what you and Ben were just talking about is exactly tracks what I told markets on the election night, which was, Democrats are now going to have their backs up a little bit more, firstly. Secondly, my view of this all along, since before the shutdown started, is this has never been about substance. Democrats picked the healthcare issue as the hill to fight on about 2 weeks before the shutdown. It was never politically they needed to show fight to their progressive base and their progressive donors. So they are continuing to do that. The election results, frankly, embolden them to continue to do that. And finally, I'd note, kind of the body language. Democratic leader Jeffries in the House gave an interview last week in which he was asked two questions. One, Speaker Johnson's office is about 30 feet from you down the hall here, and why don't you just go talk to him? And there was no response. Second, have you ever picked up the phone and called the president and said, listen, let's try to work something out? And Jeffries didn't respond to that either. To me, that body language tells you all you need to know about whether there's actual interest there in ending anything anytime soon.
Well, as we know, the initial meeting between the president and Jeffries and Schumer, it was interesting, to say the least. Not very productive, also, to say the least. Terry,
right.
So if all of this is true, then how does the logjam break between now and Thanksgiving? I know you described sort of the pressure points, but how do you think it's going to play out, and what's going to force these parties to the table?
Well, Democrats have always left themselves an escape hatch. The escape hatch is that Republicans don't want to negotiate on the health care issue. Yet Republican leaders in the House continue to say that they will. The president took a good amount of airtime in his 60 Minutes interview on Sunday to say that he'd be happy to do that. The only precondition is that they've got to get the government reopened. So it's just a matter of when Democrats want to declare victory and move forward on that basis. What they're shutting the government down over right now isn't whether or not Republicans will negotiate. It's actually over a technicality about whether or not that is linked up with the government being open or closed. So, kind of any time they want to deal with that, they can do it. Meantime, they still continue to have a few defections in the Senate, and meantime, there's also increasing outside pressure from Democratic-leaning unions and others.
Right. I want to switch gears and ask you about one of the other big things going on in Washington, and that's the Supreme Court considering the legality of the IEEPA tariffs specifically. We've been watching the odds markets here, and the odds of success by the administration in this way are going lower. So which way do you think it's going to go? Let's start there, and then I'll ask you what's going to happen next.
You won't be surprised to hear me say I'm frequently a non-consensus person. I'm non-consensus on the tariffs. I think the Supreme Court's likelier to validate them, to keep them going, than invalidate them. 2 points. The questions presented before the court, and the court gets to decide what they are fairly narrow questions about whether the IEEPA statute specifically authorizes tariffs or not, and if so, whether or not Congress exceeded its constitutional authority and gave too much authority to the president to decide those things. Those are both important issues, but they're not the only issues in the case. Fundamentally, the question has to do with whether and the court apparently doesn't disagree with this, otherwise they would have taken argument on it. Really two things. One is that the court always recognizes that the president constitutionally has the broadest and the widest discretion to deal with international emergencies. There's even a test for this, which was devised by Justice Robert Jackson in a 1952 case. Secondly, the court will not want to contribute to disrupting the administration's response to an existing international economic emergency. And thirdly, I just say parenthetically that in my day anyway, every first-year law student was taught that the court members typically will ask penetrating questions, but the penetrating questions tend to, in a lot of cases, tend to be counterfactuals and the like, and aren't, can't be taken literally to assume the direction of how the court's going to respond. So I got a situation here where they're going to be looking for ways to help the president here rather than hurt him.
We shall see, Terry. We'll catch up again. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Julie.
And as the government shutdown stretches on, now in its 37th day, the Federal Aviation Administration says it will reduce flights across the country. It says to maintain safety. Here with more on what to expect as the shutdown continues, Yahoo Finance Washington correspondent Ben Wershkul. So Ben, what do we know about these flight cuts? And this is different than even the past long shutdowns, correct? Because they didn't take measures like this.
Absolutely, yeah. This is definitely different. This is not only different from the last shutdown, it's different from what we've seen at the airport so far. So far, we've seen kind of scattered delays that have been growing each week, but not at the level of what could be in the offing in the coming days. What Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy has talked about here is 10% cuts in air traffic capacity across the country. This is 40 airports that would be affected here. This translates into thousands of canceled flights, possibly, depending on how this plays out. We don't have a formal list yet of which airports, but there's some preliminary ones floating around, and it's basically every airport you can think of. I looked at it, it was from Anchorage, Alaska, to LAX, to Atlanta, to all 4 airports in the New York area, if you count Teterboro as well. So this is essentially every airport, every major airport in the country with a 10% reduction in flights that will sort of phase in over the next coming days. It starts on Friday with the first cuts, fully implemented next week. Duffy has said that these cuts could get even deeper if we're in a shutdown in about a week's time as these air traffic controller shortages heighten. As a reminder, these controllers haven't been paid in over a month now, and the strain on the system is kind of reaching a breaking point from Duffy's perspective. This move, he says, is to alleviate the pressure and to kind of get ahead of any potential safety issues that could be in the offing.
So we just had an election. We're in the 37th day of this thing. We've got now the FAA shutdowns. Are we any closer to any kind of compromise that could end the shutdown?
Yeah, I think there's kind of bad news on that front, in that we seem to be, the mood here in Washington is essentially we are a little further from compromise today than we were a couple days ago. This week began with talk of off-ramps and bipartisan talks that were occurring potentially to kind of end the shutdown more quickly. As you mentioned, the election, that factor seems to have scrambled the calculus a little bit. This is an election that, as we all know, saw kind of widespread Democratic gains, and the response from both sides has been essentially to harden their position. President Trump's initial response, even as he admitted that the shutdown is bad politically for Republicans, his move in response is to try to end the Senate filibuster. That's a pretty unrealistic option, at least when you talk to Senate Republicans who are pretty firmly opposed to that option. So that side isn't on the same page at the moment. On the other side of the aisle, progressive Democrats have taken these results. The lesson they're taking here is we should continue to fight. They think voters appreciate the stand here, especially sort of elevating the healthcare issue, and they're less interested in compromise. You see that from figures like Bernie Sanders, Chris Murphy of Connecticut. In the middle, as always, are moderate Democratic senators who are still, I'm told, continuing to be in conversations, but they clearly have a more difficult task, at least this week, to reach some sort of short-term compromise when all that's really on the table at the moment is minimal concessions, if any, to Democrats.